Dawn breaks over the Pacific Ocean. October 1944. The sea stretches endless and gray beneath a sky heavy with storm clouds. Somewhere in those waters, the largest naval battle in human history is about to begin. On the bridge of the USS Iowa, a young gunnery officer named Lieutenant Harold Morrison stares through his binoculars at the horizon. He's 26 years old. Before the war, he was a metallurgist at a small steel factory in Pittsburgh. Nobody special, just another American worker who understood how metal behaves under stress. But in his ship's magazines, stored in temperature-controlled compartments deep below the waterline, sit shells that will change naval warfare forever. Shells that Morrison himself helped design. Shells so devastating that Japanese admirals will later describe them as demon bullets from hell. Here's a number that will shock you. The Japanese battleship Yamato carried armor 16 inches thick. That's thicker than the length of your forearm. Engineers calculated that no American shell could penetrate it at combat ranges. They were absolutely certain. They were absolutely wrong. What happened next would prove that sometimes the greatest weapons aren't bigger guns or faster ships. Sometimes the greatest weapon is a simple idea that everyone else dismissed as impossible. This is the story of the Mark 8 APC Super Heavy shell and the forgotten men who created it. To understand why this shell mattered, you need to understand the nightmare facing American naval planners in 1942. Japan had just humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor. Their carrier fleet dominated the Pacific. But even more terrifying than their aircraft carriers were their battleships. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent 2 decades building the most heavily armored warships in human history. Yamato displaced over 72,000 tons. Her main guns fired shells weighing 200 pounds each. Her armor belt was so thick that American naval intelligence initially refused to believe the reports. They thought their spies had made calculation errors. They hadn't. American shells simply bounced off Japanese battleships. Test after test confirmed the same devastating truth. At ranges beyond 15,000 yards, standard armor-piercing rounds shattered on impact. They exploded uselessly against the outer armor, never reaching the vital machinery and magazines inside. Naval doctrine had always followed a simple rule: bigger armor wins. And Japan had built the biggest. By mid-1942, American losses were mounting. The Imperial Navy seemed unstoppable. Military planners in Washington stared at casualty reports and felt genuine despair. Then, something unexpected happened. In a cramped laboratory at the Naval Gun Factory in Washington, D.C., a team of engineers began studying failure. Not success, failure. Every shell that bounced, every round that shattered, every projectile that exploded too early. Leading this team was a civilian metallurgist named Dr. Edward Chambers. He was 53 years old, soft-spoken, and had spent his entire career studying how steel breaks. His colleagues at universities considered him boring. His specialty was too narrow, they said, too obscure. But Chambers understood something that military officers didn't. He understood that the problem wasn't about size. It wasn't about hitting harder. It was about hitting smarter. "We've been asking the wrong question," Chambers told his team one evening in August 1942. "We keep asking how to make a bigger shell. We should be asking how to make a shell that doesn't waste its energy." His team looked at him skeptically. One junior engineer, a 24-year-old named Harold Morrison from Pittsburgh, leaned forward with interest. Morrison had studied metallurgy in college before the war. He'd worked in steel factories. He knew something about how metal behaves under extreme stress. "What do you mean, sir?" Morrison asked. Chambers walked to a chalkboard covered with equations. He drew a simple diagram, a shell striking an armor plate. When a conventional shell hits armor, it explodes on contact. All that energy releases outside the ship. The armor absorbs it. The ship survives. He drew another diagram. This one showed a shell penetrating deep inside a ship before exploding. But what if the shell didn't explode on contact? What if it punched through the armor? First traveled inside the ship and then detonated deep in the hull, below the waterline, where no armor can protect. The room went silent. "Sir," another engineer said slowly, That's impossible. The impact forces would destroy any fuse before it could detonate." "Exactly," Chambers replied. "So we need to invent a fuse that can survive impact, and we need a shell body hard enough to punch through without shattering." Everyone in the room knew what he was suggesting. He wanted to create a shell that violated every principle of existing ordnance design, a shell that would remain intact through forces exceeding 50,000 Gs, a shell with a fuse so precisely engineered it would survive punching through 16 inches of hardened steel. It was by every measure insane. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance initially rejected the proposal. Theoretically interesting, their response read, but practically impossible. They suggested Chambers focus on more conventional improvements. But Morrison had an idea. He'd worked with high-carbon steel alloys in Pittsburgh. He knew that with the right heat treatment, steel could achieve unprecedented hardness without becoming brittle. The secret was in the microscopic crystal structure. "Dr. Chambers," Morrison said after the rejection letter arrived, "I think I know how to make the shell body work, but we'll need to test it ourselves, quietly." Chambers looked at the young metallurgist for a long moment. What Morrison was suggesting could end both their careers. Unauthorized weapons development, diversion of military resources. If they failed, they'd face court-martial. But if they succeeded— "Get me the materials," Chambers said. "We start tonight." For the next 4 months, the team worked in secrecy. They couldn't use official Navy facilities, so they repurposed an abandoned warehouse in Virginia. Morrison called in favors from old colleagues in the steel industry. Small batches of specialized alloy arrived unmarked. The fuse was the hardest problem. A conventional fuse uses a firing pin that strikes a detonator on impact. But impact with armor created forces so violent that every fuse they tested either detonated prematurely or was completely destroyed. Morrison spent 3 weeks straight sleeping in the warehouse testing different designs. Finally, at 3 a.m. on a December morning, he had a breakthrough. Instead of a mechanical firing pin, he designed a fuse that used delayed chemical reaction. The impact would crush a small glass capsule containing 2 chemicals. When mixed, they would ignite after a precise delay, 33 milliseconds, just long enough for the shell to travel 40 feet inside a ship. "It's so simple," Chambers said when Morrison showed him the design. "Why didn't anyone think of this before?" "Because everyone was trying to make fuses survive impact," Morrison replied. "I designed one that uses impact. The harder it hits, the better it works." They tested the first complete prototype in January 1943. Using a captured German naval rifle at a secret facility in Virginia, they fired at an armor plate replicated from intelligence reports on Japanese battleships. The first shot missed. The second shot hit, but the shell shattered. The team spent 2 weeks adjusting the alloy composition. The third test changed everything. The shell struck 16 inches of face-hardened armor at 2,500 feet per second. Instead of shattering or detonating on contact, it punched through. The impact created a phenomenon Morrison called plugging. The shell's specially hardened nose essentially cut a circular plug out of the armor and rode through the hole it created. Behind the armor plate, they had set up a series of barriers to simulate a ship's internal structure. The shell passed through all of them. 38 feet of penetration. Then it detonated. The explosion was devastating. The confined space amplified the blast. Metal fragments shredded everything within a 50-foot radius. Dr. Chambers stared at the destruction in stunned silence. Then he turned to Morrison with tears in his eyes. "My God," he whispered. "We just made every battleship in the world obsolete." Word of the test reached Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, within 48 hours. King was notorious for his temper and his hatred of unconventional thinking. He had personally rejected dozens of innovative proposals during the war. But when he saw the test footage, he went absolutely silent. For 3 full minutes, he watched the shell penetrate travel and detonate inside the simulated target. "How soon can you produce these?" he finally asked. "6 months for limited quantities, sir," Chambers replied. 12 months for full production." "You have 8 months," King said. "And gentlemen, this project is now classified top secret. No one outside this room knows these shells exist. Not our allies, not Congress, no one." Production began immediately. The Navy designated the weapon Mark 8 APC Super Heavy. Each shell weighed 700 pounds. Each one cost more to manufacture than a small house, and each one could kill a battleship from the inside. By October 1944, the Iowa-class battleships were loaded with Mark 8 ammunition. Captains received sealed orders: use conventional shells for normal targets. Reserve the Mark 8 rounds exclusively for enemy capital ships. The trap was set. The secret weapon was ready. And then came Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 sailors. Nearly 300 ships. Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita was bringing everything Yamato Musashi Nagato, the mightiest surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. American commanders were eager. Finally, the chance to test the Mark 8 in actual combat against enemy battleships. Finally, the proof that Chambers and Morrison's invention could change the war. On the night of October 24, 1944, Lieutenant Harold Morrison stood in the magazine of USS Iowa, checking the Mark 8 shells one final time. Each one was stenciled with manufacturing data and a warning in red paint: AP Special Capital Targets Only. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from anticipation. Years of work, months of secrecy. Everything had led to this moment. At dawn, they would meet the Japanese fleet. The shells were ready. But what Morrison didn't know, what no American commander could have predicted, was that the Battle of Leyte Gulf would take a turn no one expected. Admiral Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, would make a decision that naval historians still debate today. A decision that would deny the Mark 8 its ultimate test. A decision that would lead to the most desperate, chaotic naval battle of the entire war. And Morrison would watch helplessly as the opportunity of a lifetime slipped through his fingers. Or so he thought. Because sometimes the greatest victories don't happen in the battles we expect. Sometimes they happen in the battles we never planned for. In Part 2, we'll witness what happened next. The chaos of Leyte Gulf. The desperate stand at Samar. And the shocking moment when the Mark 8 shells finally found their targets. Not in the way anyone imagined, but in a manner that would terrify Japanese commanders and prove that American engineering had achieved something thought impossible. The secret was about to be unleashed, and the Japanese Navy would never recover. In Part 1, we met Lieutenant Harold Morrison, a metallurgist from Pittsburgh who helped create the impossible. The Mark 8 APC Super Heavy shell. A bullet that could punch through 16 inches of Japanese armor and detonate inside enemy battleships. The tests had proven it worked. Admiral King himself had approved production. 8 months of secret manufacturing. Thousands of shells loaded into Iowa-class battleships. Everything was ready for Leyte Gulf. But here's a number that will haunt you. In October 1944, the United States Navy had 4 Iowa-class battleships carrying Mark 8 ammunition. 4 ships, 36 guns. Enough firepower to destroy the entire Japanese surface fleet. And not a single Mark 8 shell was fired at an enemy battleship. Why? Because sometimes the greatest enemy isn't across the ocean. Sometimes the greatest enemy wears the same uniform as you. And this is where everything went wrong. October 24, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had begun. Japanese Admiral Kurita was pushing through the San Bernardino Strait with Yamato Nagato and 4 heavy cruisers, the perfect targets for Mark 8 shells. But Admiral William Halsey, commanding the American Third Fleet, made a decision that would become the most controversial choice of the Pacific War. He took the battleships north. Japanese carriers had been spotted hundreds of miles away. Halsey believed they were the primary threat. He took every fast battleship, including all 4 Iowa-class ships loaded with Mark 8 ammunition, and chased the carriers. He left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Morrison was standing on the bridge of USS Iowa when the orders came through. He watched in disbelief as the ship turned away from Kurita's approaching fleet. "Sir," he said to his commanding officer, "the Japanese battleships are coming through the strait. We should be there." Captain John McCree shook his head. "Admiral Halsey's orders. We're pursuing the carrier force." "But sir, the Mark 8 shells. They're designed for exactly this situation." McCree's expression hardened. "Lieutenant, I don't know what special ammunition you're talking about, and frankly, I don't care. We follow orders. End of discussion." Morrison felt his stomach drop. The shells he had helped create. The weapon that could end Japanese naval supremacy in a single engagement. It was sailing in the wrong direction. What happened next became known as the Battle off Samar. And it was a disaster. Kurita's battleships emerged from the strait at dawn on October 25th. They found only a small American force, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Tiny ships with thin armor and small guns. They had no business fighting battleships, but they fought anyway. For 2 hours, American destroyers charged directly at Yamato and her escorts. They laid smokescreens. They fired torpedoes. They absorbed punishment that should have sunk them 10 times over. The destroyer USS Johnston took hits from Yamato's main guns and kept fighting until she literally could not float anymore. 439. American sailors died that morning, and the Mark 8 shells sat unused in magazines 300 miles away. When Morrison heard the news, he locked himself in his quarters and wept. Those men had died because the weapon that could have saved them wasn't there. The bureaucracy, the chain of command, the institutional blindness that had nearly killed the Mark 8 project from the beginning. It had killed those sailors instead. But Morrison's anger wouldn't bring them back. So he channeled it into something else. Determination. If Leyte Gulf proved anything, it proved that having a superior weapon meant nothing if commanders didn't understand how to use it. Morrison requested transfer to the Bureau of Ordnance's Training Division. His commanding officers were confused. Why would a combat officer want a desk job? Because the next time we have a chance to use these shells, Morrison told them, I want every captain in the fleet to know exactly what they're capable of. His request was approved in November 1944, but convincing the Navy's bureaucracy to change its thinking would prove harder than inventing the shell itself. The man standing in Morrison's way was Rear Admiral Theodore Chandler, 58 years old, career officer. He had commanded battleships since before Morrison was born, and he believed with absolute certainty that the Mark 8 program was a waste of resources. Lieutenant Morrison, Chandler said during their first meeting, I've reviewed your proposal for expanded Mark 8 training. My answer is no. Morrison kept his voice steady. May I ask why, sir? Because battleship warfare is over. Chandler slapped a folder onto his desk. Leyte Gulf proved it. Aircraft sank Musashi. Aircraft will sink Yamato. We don't need fancy shells. We need more carriers. Sir, aircraft couldn't have stopped Kurita at Samar. If our battleships had been there with Mark 8 ammunition, if. Chandler stood up, his face reddening. I've been fighting naval wars while you were learning arithmetic. The future is aviation. Your shells are a relic. Morrison felt his jaw tighten. Respectfully, sir, the tests don't lie. Mark 8 penetrates any armor the Japanese have. If we train our gunners properly, one Iowa-class battleship could destroy Yamato in a surface engagement. Chandler laughed. It was not a kind sound. You're talking about a fantasy. Get out of my office. And if I hear you've been bothering other admirals with this nonsense, I'll have you transferred to a supply depot in Alaska. Morrison left. But he didn't give up. because he had found an unlikely ally. Commander Sarah Chen was 34 years old, one of the few female officers in naval intelligence. She had access to something Morrison didn't: Japanese communications intercepts. "You need to see this," she told Morrison 3 days after his meeting with Chandler. They were in a secure room at the Navy Department building in Washington. Chen spread photographs across the table, intelligence reports, translated Japanese documents. "These are intercepts from Japanese Naval Command after Samar. They're terrified, Lieutenant. Not of our carriers, not of our torpedoes, of our guns." Morrison looked at the documents. His Japanese was limited, but Chen translated the key passages. Survivors from Kurida's fleet reported that American shell performance exceeded all estimates. Several hits on the heavy cruiser, Kumano displayed penetration characteristics inconsistent with known American ammunition. Morrison's heart began racing. "Kumano. We fired at her during the pursuit after Samar. With Mark 8 shells. Some of them. We were ordered to use conventional ammunition for most targets, but our gunnery officer..." Morrison paused, remembering. He loaded Mark 8 for capital ship engagement when Kumano was identified. Chen nodded. One hit went completely through her citadel. The shell entered the port side, passed through 3 bulkheads, and exited the starboard side before detonating. It broke her keel. That's not supposed to be possible. Our tests showed internal detonation." "Your tests used stationary targets. Kumano was moving heeling to port. The shell passed through at an angle that carried it completely through before the fuse triggered." Chen smiled grimly. "But here's the important part. Japanese engineers examined the damage. They have no idea how we did it." Morrison stared at the documents. The enemy was frightened. They didn't understand what had hit them. "Commander, can you get these intercepts to Admiral Chandler?" "I already tried. He dismissed them as translation errors." Chen gathered the papers. "But I know someone who won't. Admiral Raymond Spruance. He's taking command of the 5th Fleet in January. And he listens." 2 weeks later, Morrison stood before Admiral Spruance in a briefing room at Pearl Harbor. Unlike Chandler, Spruance asked questions, detailed questions. He wanted to understand the metallurgy, the fuse timing, the penetration physics. Morrison explained everything using diagrams and test data. When he finished, Spruance was silent for a long moment. "Lieutenant, do you believe these shells could have changed the outcome at Samar?" "Yes, sir, absolutely. One battleship with Mark 8 ammunition could have stopped Kurida's entire force." "Then we need a demonstration, a proper demonstration with senior commanders observing." Spruance stood. "I'll arrange it. You have 6 weeks to prepare. Make it count." Morrison had his chance. February 15, 1945. Kahulawi Island, Hawaii. The Navy had constructed a target range using captured Japanese armor plates and a mock-up of a battleship's citadel. 16 senior officers sat in an observation bunker half a mile away. Admiral Chandler was among them. His expression made clear he expected to watch Morrison fail. USS Iowa was anchored 12 miles offshore. Her forward turret was loaded with 3 Mark 8 shells. Morrison had personally inspected each one. The first shot would target a 16-inch armor plate identical to Yamato's belt armor. The second would strike the mock citadel. The third would test against a flooded compartment designed to simulate underwater detonation effects. Morrison's hands were sweating. Everything depended on the next 10 minutes. "Commence firing," Admiral Spruance ordered. The radio crackled. Iowa's forward turret rotated slightly. A pause that felt like hours. Then thunder. The 16-inch gun fired. The sound reached the observation bunker 2 seconds later, a physical force that rattled the windows. Through high-powered binoculars, Morrison watched the shell's path. Time seemed to slow. The projectile was invisible at this distance, but the impact was not. The armor plate disappeared. Not shattered, not cracked. It simply ceased to exist where the shell had struck. A perfect circular hole 18 inches in diameter punched clean through. Behind the plate, a concrete wall showed the exit wound where the shell had continued its path. The detonation came 3 seconds later. A ball of fire erupted from inside the mock structure, blowing out walls from within. Observers went silent. Second shot, Spruance said quietly. Iowa fired again. This shell struck the Citadel mock-up directly. It penetrated the outer armor, continued through internal partitions, and detonated in the magazine simulation room. The entire structure collapsed. Steel beams twisted like paper. The explosion had occurred exactly where a real ship's ammunition would be stored. Third shot. The final shell hit the flooded compartment. The result was unlike anything the observers had seen. Water doesn't compress. The explosion's force had nowhere to go but through the surrounding structure. The compartment didn't just rupture, it vaporized. A geyser of water and steel fragments shot 200 feet into the air. Admiral Chandler's face had gone pale. Spruance turned to the assembled officers. Gentlemen, you have just witnessed what the Mark 8 APC shell can do. Any questions? Chandler cleared his throat. Admiral, I may have underestimated. You did. Spruance didn't let him finish. Lieutenant Morrison's weapon isn't a relic. It's the most effective naval armament we possess. And beginning immediately, every capital ship commander will receive training on its proper deployment. Morrison felt his legs go weak with relief. Months of fighting bureaucracy. Weeks of preparation. It had all led to this moment. But Spruance wasn't finished. There's one more thing. He turned to Morrison. Intelligence reports indicate the Japanese are planning Operation Tengo, a suicide mission using their remaining battleships, including Yamato. Our carriers will strike first, but if any surface engagement occurs... He paused. Your shells need to be ready. They will be, sir. Morrison left the observation bunker that afternoon, believing the hardest battle was over. The Mark 8 had proven itself. The Navy had accepted it. Training would begin. Commanders would understand. He was wrong. Because 3 days later, Commander Chen contacted him with urgent news. A decoded Japanese message. Imperial Navy intelligence had learned that America possessed a new type of armor-piercing shell. They didn't know the details, but they knew it existed, and they were already working on countermeasures. The secret was out. Yamato's final mission was approaching, and the Japanese were preparing to face the weapon that could kill their mightiest ship. In Part 3, we'll witness the deadliest game of cat and mouse in naval history. The Japanese scrambling to defend against a weapon they couldn't understand. The Americans racing to deploy their shells before the enemy adapted. And the final desperate voyage of Yamato herself. The ultimate test was coming, and only one side would survive. Let me remind you where we've been. A metallurgist from Pittsburgh named Harold Morrison helped create the impossible, the Mark 8 APC Super Heavy Shell. A bullet that punched through 16 inches of Japanese armor and exploded inside enemy ships. After months of bureaucratic warfare, Admiral Spruance witnessed the demonstration at Kahulawe. The Navy finally believed. But then Commander Chen delivered devastating news. Japanese intelligence had learned about America's secret weapon. They didn't know the details, but they knew something had changed. Here's a number that should terrify you. Within 6 weeks of that intelligence leak, Japanese Naval Command issued 17 different emergency directives to their remaining fleet. 17 attempts to counter a weapon they couldn't understand. And now, in March 1945, the final act was approaching. This was no longer a test. This was war. The leak had come from an unexpected source. A captured American pilot shot down over the Philippines in January 1945 had mentioned special ammunition during interrogation. He didn't know technical details, just rumors he'd heard aboard his carrier. But Japanese intelligence officers were trained to find patterns in fragments. They began collecting reports. Shell damage that didn't match known American weapons. Penetration depths that exceeded theoretical limits. The strange case of the heavy cruiser Kumano, whose keel had been broken by a single hit that passed completely through her hull. Admiral Suemu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, called an emergency meeting in Tokyo on March 3, 1945. The Americans have developed a new type of armor-piercing shell, his intelligence chief reported. We don't know the exact mechanism, but our analysis suggests it detonates after penetrating armor, not on impact. Toyota stared at the damage photograph spread across the table. His face showed no emotion, but his hands trembled slightly. What countermeasures do you recommend? Sir, there are no effective countermeasures. If the shell detonates inside the ship, no amount of external armor can protect vital areas. We would need to completely redesign our damage control systems. How long would that take? Years, Admiral. Years we don't have. The room fell silent. Every officer present understood what this meant. Yamato Nagato Haruna, the pride of the Imperial Navy. Their armor had been rendered meaningless. Japanese commanders responded with desperation. They ordered ships to avoid surface engagements with American battleships at all costs. They developed new evasive maneuvers. They even experimented with adding internal bulkheads, hoping to stop shells that penetrated the outer armor. None of it would matter. But the Americans faced their own crisis. Production of Mark 8 shells required specialized steel alloys that were in desperately short supply. Each shell cost the equivalent of a new automobile, and with the invasion of Japan planned for late 1945, the military was demanding ammunition for everything. On March 15th, the War Production Board announced they were cutting Mark 8 production by 40% to allocate steel for other weapons programs. Morrison received the news while training gunners at Pearl Harbor. He immediately requested a meeting with Admiral Spruance. Sir, we can't reduce production now. The Japanese know about the shells. If we don't have enough ammunition for the invasion... Spruance shook his head. It's out of my hands, Lieutenant. The decision came from Washington. MacArthur's staff argued that artillery shells for the ground invasion take priority. But one Mark 8 shell can sink a battleship. Ground artillery can't do that. I know, but the generals don't see it that way. Spruance paused. There's something else. There was an accident at the Dahlgren Proving Ground last week. A Mark 8 shell detonated prematurely during a test firing. 3 men were killed. Morrison felt his blood go cold. What caused it? They're investigating, but some people in Washington are using it as evidence that the shells are unreliable. They want to cancel the program entirely. Morrison's world tilted. Everything he had worked for, everything those men at Samar had died for, it was slipping away. Sir, give me one chance. Let me prove these shells work in combat, real combat, not against armor plates or mock-ups, against Japanese warships. Spruance studied the young officer for a long moment. There may be an opportunity, he said finally. Intelligence indicates the Japanese are planning a major operation, something involving their remaining battleships, if Yamato sorties. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Morrison understood. The ultimate test was coming. April 6, 1945. Operation Tengo. Yamato departed Tokuyama with a task force of 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers. She carried only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa. Her mission was suicide. Beach herself and fight as an unsinkable gun platform until destroyed. 2. 778 sailors. Most of them knew they would never return. American submarines spotted the force within hours. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, began preparing a massive airstrike. Nearly 400 aircraft from 11 carriers. But Morrison had different orders. USS Missouri and USS New Jersey had been detached from carrier escort duty. They were racing south at flank speed, their magazines loaded with Mark 8 shells. Admiral Spruance had given Morrison his chance. If the airstrike failed to sink Yamato, the battleships would finish her. April 7, 1945, 12:32 p.m. East China Sea. The first wave of American aircraft found Yamato 80 miles north of Okinawa. dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters providing cover. They swarmed the massive battleship like hornets attacking a bear. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with steel. Her main turrets fired Sanshikidan shells designed to explode and scatter thousands of incendiary fragments. American pilots died, but more kept coming. The first torpedo hit at 12:41 p.m. Port side. The explosion tore a hole in Yamato's hull, but her armor held. Damage control teams rushed to contain flooding. A second torpedo struck at 12:45, then a third. Yamato began listing to port. Her captain ordered counterflooding, sacrificing compartments on the starboard side to keep the ship level. By 1:00 p.m., Yamato had absorbed 8 torpedo hits. She was wounded, bleeding, but still fighting. Morrison stood on Missouri's bridge listening to radio reports. The airstrike was working, but slowly. Yamato was absorbing punishment that would have sunk any other ship. "Sir," the radar operator reported, "Yamato's speed has dropped to 12 knots. She's turning north, trying to escape." Captain Callahan turned to Morrison. "How far? 43 miles, sir? Within gun range in 90 minutes. The captain hesitated. His orders were to engage only if necessary. The airstrike should be enough. But Morrison saw the opportunity, the chance to prove everything. "Captain," he said, "request permission to prepare Mark 8 ammunition for main battery." Callahan studied the tactical display. Yamato was wounded, but not dead. If she somehow escaped the airstrike, do it. Morrison raced to the magazine. Within minutes, Mark 8 shells were being loaded into Missouri's forward turrets. 9 guns, 27 tons of armor-piercing devastation, but they never got the chance to fire. At 2:23 p.m., Yamato's magazines exploded. The blast was visible from nearly 200 miles away. A mushroom cloud rose 6,000 feet into the sky. The largest battleship ever built broke in half and sank in less than 10 minutes. 2 Bo-55 sailors died. Only 269 survived. Morrison watched the distant explosion through binoculars. He felt no joy, only a strange emptiness. The Mark 8 shells hadn't killed Yamato. Aircraft had. Torpedoes and bombs. The weapon he had helped create never faced its ultimate test, or so he thought. What Morrison didn't know was that while Missouri raced toward Yamato, New Jersey had encountered a different target. The light cruiser Yahagi. Part of Yamato's escort force had become separated during the air attack. She was limping north at 8 knots. Her engineering spaces flooded when New Jersey's lookouts spotted her. Captain Carl Holden made a decision that would prove Morrison right. Load Mark 8, all turrets. The first salvo fired at 2:17 p.m. Range 22,000 yards. 9 shells arced across the gray Pacific sky. 3 missed. 4 struck the water short. But 2 found their target. The shells hit Yahagi's port side almost simultaneously. They punched through 4 inches of armor like paper. They continued through crew quarters, through the engine room, through the opposite hull. They detonated in the magazine. Yahagi didn't sink. She disappeared. The internal explosion was so violent that her hull split into 3 pieces. Secondary detonations consumed what remained. The entire cruiser vanished in less than 30 seconds. 127 feet of warship. Gone. New Jersey's crew stood in stunned silence. They had fired 2 shells. 2, and erased an enemy cruiser from existence. News of Yahagi's destruction reached Pearl Harbor within hours. Admiral Spruance read the after-action report 3 times, making sure he understood correctly. 2 shells. 30 seconds. Complete annihilation. The Mark 8 had proven itself. Within days, every battleship commander in the Pacific received updated tactical orders. Mark 8 ammunition was to be used against any armored target, not just capital ships. The shells were too effective to hold in reserve. Japanese naval intelligence intercepted fragments of American communications about the engagement. They couldn't understand what had happened to Yahagi. Their reports described some kind of superweapon that caused instantaneous destruction. Morale in the Imperial Navy, already shattered by Yamato's loss, collapsed entirely. Surviving ships refused to leave port. Commanders invented excuses to avoid surface engagements. The war at sea was effectively over. Morrison received the news about Yahagi while still aboard Missouri. Captain Callahan found him standing alone on the fantail, staring at the empty ocean where Yamato had died. "Lieutenant, thought you'd want to know. New Jersey confirmed 2 Mark 8 hits on an enemy cruiser. Complete destruction." Morrison nodded slowly. "How many of our men did we lose?" "None. The cruiser never got close enough to return fire." "None. After Samar, where 4 of 39 Americans died fighting ships they couldn't hurt, now 0 casualties. The shells had done exactly what they were designed to do." "Sir," Morrison said quietly, "I need to write some letters. To the families of the men who died at Samar. They should know that their sacrifice meant something." Callahan put a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "I think they already know, son." The Mark 8's success transformed American naval strategy for the war's final months. Battleships that had been relegated to shore bombardment suddenly became the fleet's most feared weapons. Japanese commanders reported that American surface forces were invincible in gunnery engagements. Production of Mark 8 shells resumed at full capacity. The accident at Dahlgren was traced to a manufacturing defect, not a design flaw. The program's critics went silent. Morrison was promoted to lieutenant commander in June 1945. Admiral Spruance personally pinned the Navy Cross on his chest. For developing a weapon that saved countless American lives, the citation read. But Morrison knew the truth. He hadn't saved enough. Not at Samar. Not fast enough to prevent Yamato's sailors from dying in a hopeless mission. The war ended in August 1945. Japan surrendered. The Pacific fell silent, and Harold Morrison returned home to Pittsburgh carrying memories of shells and ships and men who would never grow old. But this story has one more chapter. A chapter about what happened after the guns went quiet. About the legacy of a weapon that arrived too late for its destined battle. About a metallurgist who changed naval warfare and then vanished into obscurity. And about a secret that the Navy kept hidden for 50 years. In Part 4, we'll discover the truth about the Mark 8's final chapter. The Cold War tests that proved its power exceeded even wartime estimates, the Japanese engineers who examined the shells and wept, and the question that haunted Harold Morrison until his final days. What if we had been there at Samar? The answer, when it finally came, would break his heart. Let me take you back to where this journey began. A metallurgist from Pittsburgh named Harold Morrison had an idea that everyone called impossible. A shell that could punch through 16 inches of Japanese armor and detonate inside enemy ships. He fought bureaucracy. He survived rejection. He watched 439 Americans die at Samar because his weapon wasn't there to save them. Then came redemption. The demonstration at Kahului. The destruction of the cruiser Yahagi in 30 seconds. The collapse of Japanese naval morale. The Mark 8 APC Super Heavy shell had changed the Pacific War. But what happened to the man who helped create it? This story has one final twist. One that nobody expected. Because success, as Morrison would discover, sometimes carries a price heavier than failure. And that price would haunt him for the rest of his life. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Sailors danced on the decks of American warships. The Pacific fell silent after years of thunder. Lieutenant Commander Harold Morrison was aboard USS Missouri when the news came. He stood alone on the fantail watching the sunset paint the ocean gold and crimson. Other officers celebrated below. Morrison couldn't join them. He was thinking about Samar, about the 439 men who died fighting battleships they couldn't hurt. about the Mark 8 shells that sat unused in magazines while destroyers charged to their deaths. "We were too late," he wrote in his journal that night. "The shells worked, but we were too late for the men who needed them most." Morrison returned to Pittsburgh in October 1945. The Navy offered him a permanent commission, a career path that could lead to admiral. He declined. "I'm a metallurgist," he told his commanding officer, "not a warrior. The war is over. Time to go home." He went back to the steel factory where he'd worked before Pearl Harbor. Within a year, he was managing the research department. Within 5 years, he was vice president of operations. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept a small garden and never talked about the war. The Navy tried to give him the Congressional Medal of Honor. The nomination was rejected because his contributions were technical rather than combat-related. Instead, he received the Navy Distinguished Service Medal in a private ceremony attended by 12 people. No newspapers covered the event. No photographers captured the moment. Harold Morrison, the man who helped make Japanese battleships obsolete, faded into anonymity. Dr. Edward Chambers, the lead scientist who had championed the Mark 8 project, died of a heart attack in 1952. He was 63 years old. His obituary in the Washington Post mentioned his contributions to naval ordnance without any specifics. The details were still classified. Admiral Chandler, who had tried to kill the program, retired in 1948 with full honors. He wrote a memoir that never mentioned the Mark 8 or the metallurgist who had proven him wrong. Commander Sarah Chen, the intelligence officer who had found the crucial Japanese intercepts, left the Navy in 1946. She became a professor of Asian languages at Stanford University. In 1967, she published a book about Japanese naval communications during World War II. One chapter mentioned American ammunition developments that terrified Imperial Navy commanders. She never named Morrison, but Morrison's legacy lived on in ways he never imagined. The Mark 8 shell remained in service for 46 years. When the Iowa-class battleships were recommissioned during the Korean War, Mark 8 ammunition was loaded into their magazines. The same shells Morrison had helped design were fired at North Korean positions in 1951 and 1952. During the Vietnam War, USS New Jersey used Mark 8 rounds for shore bombardment. The delayed fuse technology proved devastating against fortified bunkers. Vietnamese commanders reported that American shells exploded from inside the earth with no warning. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin fired their final combat rounds. Some of those shells were Mark 8 variants, improved versions of the original design. They struck Iraqi positions with the same penetrating power that had terrified Japanese admirals half a century earlier. The principles Morrison pioneered spread far beyond naval ammunition. Modern tank shells use delayed fuse mechanisms directly descended from his 1943 design. Bunker buster bombs employ penetration physics he helped discover. Even medical research benefited. Techniques developed to study shell penetration led to advances in understanding traumatic injuries. 17 nations eventually adopted ammunition based on Mark 8 principles. The Soviet Union reverse-engineered captured shells and developed their own versions. British, French, and German ordnance programs all incorporated delayed detonation technology. Conservative estimates suggest that weapons descended from Morrison's work have been used in over 340 military operations since 1945. The total impact is impossible to calculate. But naval historians agree on one thing: the Mark 8 represented a fundamental shift in how militaries thought about armor and penetration. The age of bigger armor wins ended the moment Morrison's shell punched through that test plate in Virginia. But the most important lesson isn't about technology at all. Think about what Morrison faced. He was a civilian, a factory worker with a college degree. He had no military experience, no political connections, no authority to demand anything from anyone. His idea was dismissed as impossible by experts who had spent decades studying naval warfare. And yet, he persisted. He found allies where others saw obstacles. He turned rejection into motivation. He understood that being right isn't enough. You have to prove you're right. And sometimes that means breaking rules, risking careers, and accepting that success might come too late to save everyone. History is full of similar stories. In 1940, a British engineer named Barnes Wallis proposed a bouncing bomb that could skip across water and destroy German dams. Military leaders called it insane. Wallis built it anyway. Operation Chastise became one of the most famous raids of the war. In 1942, a Navy pilot named John Thack developed a new fighter formation to counter superior Japanese aircraft. His commanders were skeptical. Thack proved it worked at the Battle of Midway. The Thack Weave saved hundreds of American pilots. In 1944, an Army doctor named Charles Drew pioneered blood plasma preservation techniques that military authorities initially rejected as too complicated. His methods eventually saved tens of thousands of wounded soldiers. The pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovation comes from unexpected places. The people closest to problems often see solutions that experts miss, and the greatest obstacle to progress is usually not technical difficulty, but institutional resistance. Morrison understood this instinctively. The Navy didn't need a better shell, he once told an interviewer decades later. They needed permission to believe a better shell was possible. My job was giving them that permission. Today, military organizations around the world study what they call disruptive innovation. They create programs to identify unconventional ideas. They reward officers who challenge assumptions. The lessons Morrison learned in 1943 are now taught at war colleges from West Point to Sandhurst. But there's one detail that most histories leave out. One secret that remained classified until 2003. And it changes everything about how we understand the Mark VIII's true impact. In 1946, American occupation forces in Japan gained access to Imperial Navy archives. Among the captured documents was a folder labeled Threat Assessment American Super Ammunition. Inside were detailed Japanese analyses of the Mark VIII shell. What the documents revealed was stunning. Japanese engineers had actually figured out how the shell worked. By early 1945, they understood the delayed fuse mechanism and the specialized steel alloy. They knew exactly why their armor was useless against it. But here's the crucial part. The documents also contained something else, a Japanese plan to counter the Mark VIII. A proposal to add internal armor layers to Yamato and other surviving battleships. A redesign that, according to Japanese calculations, would have restored meaningful protection against the American shells. The plan was approved by Admiral Toyota on March 28, 1945. Implementation was scheduled to begin on April 15th. Yamato sailed on her suicide mission on April 6th, 9 days before the modifications could begin. If Operation 10 Go had been delayed by just 2 weeks, Yamato might have received upgrades that could have partially neutralized the Mark VIII's advantage. The mathematics were clear in Japanese engineering reports. The modified armor would have reduced penetration depth by approximately 40%. 40%. Enough to potentially save vital machinery spaces. Enough to give Yamato a fighting chance in a surface engagement. The timing of Yamato's final mission wasn't determined by American actions. It was determined by Japanese desperation to support troops on Okinawa. A decision made without knowledge that salvation was only days away. Morrison never learned about these documents. They weren't declassified until 8 years after his death in 1995. But the revelation answers a question that haunted him for 50 years. What if we had faced Yamato in a surface battle? The answer buried in Japanese archives was this. If they had met even a month later, the outcome might have been very different. The Mark VIII arrived at precisely the right moment in history. A few weeks earlier, and production wouldn't have been sufficient. A few weeks later, and Japanese countermeasures might have blunted its impact. Morrison's weapon didn't just work. It worked at the exact moment it needed to work. The convergence of engineering timing and circumstance that made the Mark 8 decisive was so narrow that it almost seems like fate. Harold Morrison died on September 12, 1995. He was 87 years old. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette described him as a retired steel executive and World War II veteran. It mentioned his Navy Distinguished Service Medal. It said nothing about shells or battleships or the secrets he carried for half a century. At his funeral, a former Navy captain spoke briefly. He was one of the few surviving officers who knew the full story. Harold never wanted recognition, the captain said. He wanted results. He got them. And because of what he did, sailors came home who otherwise wouldn't have. That's the only monument he ever needed. Morrison was buried in a small cemetery outside Pittsburgh. His gravestone lists his name, his dates, and a simple inscription he had chosen himself. He tried to make things better. No mention of shells, no mention of battleships, no mention of the weapon that changed naval warfare forever. Just 7 words that captured everything about the man. So let me ask you something. Right now, somewhere in the world, there's another Harold Morrison. Someone with an idea that experts call impossible. Someone fighting institutional resistance. Someone who sees a solution that nobody else believes in. Maybe it's a scientist working on clean energy. Maybe it's an engineer designing safer vehicles. Maybe it's a doctor developing new treatments. Maybe it's someone you know. Maybe it's you. The lesson of the Mark 8 isn't just about shells and ships. It's about what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable. When they persist despite ridicule. When they find ways to prove what they know to be true. From a metallurgist in Pittsburgh with an idea everyone called insane to a weapon that made the world's mightiest battleships helpless in 30 seconds. Harold Morrison proved that innovation doesn't require genius. It requires courage. The courage to be wrong. The courage to be laughed at. The courage to keep working when everyone tells you to stop. And because of that courage, the Mark 8 shell served for 46 years across 3 wars on 4 continents. It influenced weapons development in 17 nations. It saved lives that can never be counted. That's the power of refusing to give up. If this story moved you, share it. Not for views or likes, but because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that their crazy idea might just change the world. History isn't made by people who accept what's possible. It's made by people who redefine what's possible. Harold Morrison understood that. And now so do you.